Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 14 of season 5 of Babylon 5, Meditations on the Abyss. Interestingly, after a rear to front station establishing shot, we find Delenn not as sleepy as John, and indeed sneaking out from their quarters. The excuse she gives seems flimsy, which is interesting as Minbari don't lie. Shortly after, a hooded Delenn appears in a culturally diverse drinking establishment, where she is propositioned in a less than pleasant manner, which leads to a broken finger on the gentleman's part, but Delenn notes he has 9 others for the time being. His continued pursuit leads him to be intercepted by a ranger, rapidly revealed to be Linnea, summoned by Delenn. The soundtrack is reminiscent of the Matrix movie's fight scenes. There follows a conversation in a dark corner of down below, far from prying eyes and ears, which for Linnea at least is full of irony and subtext about why Delenn doesn't want to involve Sheridan in her decision to have Linnea patrol on the border of Centauri space to try and find the solid proof they need of Centauri involvement in the attacks on shipping lanes. She is concerned that his love for her would confuse his decision making in suggesting Linnea put his life on the line to take the mission, as she cares for Linnea, and marks his loss as still recent and painful. Yet Delenn knows they need Linnea's experience with the Centauri. He'll be stationed on White Star 27, but his captain won't have the details of his mission. He's just been told to train the recruits in space combat near the Centauri border. Delenn instructs him to return as soon as he has something. Before they part, Linnea tells her of his meeting with Morden on the Day of the Dead, and his prophecy of his betrayal of Yann LeShock. Delenn says she cannot believe anything would make him do that, and he agrees. And yet... In Londo's quarters, a figure struggles with a pile of boxes in the doorway. Veer, laden down with supplies. It seems he's been eating at Mukbari's, which hasn't been agreeing with him, so he's only now restocking, after Londo's return. Not without consequence, as Londo is about to give him news about his position when a subtle alarm goes off. Londo scans the new packages and unearths a bug of the listening device variety in a package bought from a Drazi. Having suggested the Drazi ambassador's wife once had a fling with the game ambassador, Londo destroys the bug, thinking little of it. He finally tells Veer that once he leaves to become emperor, Veer will take over his role as ambassador on the station. He thinks he'll be ready by then, which will mean no more eating at Mukbari's. Linnea's ship has a human captain, who has named his ship after his sister Maria. Unofficially, although it looks like her name might be on the hull. Linnea asks after his sister, but she's passed away. Linnea regrets having asked the question, but a fellow Minbari assures him that the captain believes in impertinent questions. Whilst his captain knows of his past service history with Delenn and Sheridan, he'll be treated as any other trainee. They jump out. The Drazi ambassador presses the advisory council in private, less Londo, as to rumours that it might be the Centauri who are behind the raids. Jakar was up to that point excited by the prospect of a matching eye turning up for him. The Drazi ambassador presses his point that the advisory council does of course have a significant member from the Centauri, and so could be conflicted. He goes on to remind them that they promise to support any decision the members made about the party responsible for the raiding activities. Sheridan acknowledges and confirms this, but stresses that without absolute proof about who's behind the attacks, they will not release any information, and asks the Drazi to be patient, as they have been with the Drazi before now. The Drazi agrees to this, just as Londo appears to join the meeting. He proceeds to chastise them for not waiting for him, and then warns them about bugging, not outright blaming the Drazi, but making many references to his beautiful, tired wife. He then takes his leave again. Linnea and Findel have been instructed to take 2 fighters out when the Maria re-enters normal space. They have not been instructed to do anything in particular, which Findel notes is not unusual for the captain, and Linnea says it is designed to encourage flexible thinking, something the Minbari are not great at. Findel doesn't really see his point, and they leave for the fighter bay. Franklin is busy extracting Jakar's artificial blue eye. As he prepares to swap in the red replacement, they discuss the books of Jakar, Jakar noting his embarrassment at it having come out before his death. Franklin thinks it's good, but is puzzled about a circular mark on page 83. Jakar chuckles, explaining every non-religious book is reproduced exactly as the original, warts and all. The circular mark is in fact a coffee stain left on it by Mr. Garibaldi, ostensibly the best part of the book in his opinion. Franklin completes the insertion and asks a favour. As a foundationist, he is interested in the core of all religions and would like to attend Jakar's discussion sessions on its book. Jakar is happy to share his confusion with him, as he's given him back his sight. The Maria jumps into normal space and we get a first look at the insides of a Minbari fighter as Lanier and Findel launch out. They lie in them horizontally with their heads almost in a bubble at the front of the craft. Shortly after launching from the rear of the White Star, Lanier runs through his systems checks again, but finds that his life support levels are low, an hour of breathable air. Findel confirms that his levels have changed radically too, as they read full before launching. As Findel considers returning to the ship, they watch aghast as the White Star jumps out and leaves them adrift, as they are not jump capable. They ponder what might have caused the need for it to leave them so hurriedly, then turn their attention to their situation, which is serious, as no planet is within range of their air supply. Lanier reasons that their best bet is to meditate in order to slow their metabolisms down and burn less air, extending the duration of their reserves. Findel is not sure he can, but Lanier says it is not necessary to know, only to try. In similar fashion, Jakar is fielding questions from his acolytes who wish to know many things, but are seemingly unwillingly to try to understand, when Jakar offers them his understanding of the universe, that the search for God is not as revealing of God as it is revealing of the nature of the universe around them. Franklin watches on in quiet amusement as Jakar is forced to fall back on simple metaphors that the acolytes can interpret however they see fit before the session ends. Findel starts to panic and starts heading off as Lanier tries to calm him, but at that moment the Maria returns to retrieve them and Montoya proceeds to deliver the lesson, that the mission comes first, that death is not to be feared, just failure to complete a mission. He praises Lanier's assessment of the situation: stay put to aid retrieval, slow metabolism to extend air supply. On the station, Veer challenges the Drazi who sold him the bugged package, but backs off when the Drazi asserts himself and deems Veer a weakling. Also we think, as in fact he returns to Londo's quarters, grabs a Centauri dueling blade from the wall, and returns with Londo following to smash up the vendor's stall and get his confession cum apology. As Zack asks Londo what's going on, Londo explains with a grin he's promoted Veer, and now he's ready to become an ambassador. The trainees have been given a new mission, an Easter egg hunt in an asteroid field. 4 will head out, but only 3 can get enough eggs to complete their task. Someone will come up short, and weapon systems will be hot. So this task will demand fancy flying and attention to the competition. Findel clearly feels the captain has it in for him and believes he will fail, but Lanier says that's his own doubts talking. When he probes further, it is clear Findel joined the Anla Shock to try and continue the work of fallen rangers from his family, not because it was his choice. So Lanier sees his purpose as flawed, which simply makes Findel angrier. Blood-red light bathes the White Star from the local dwarf as the fighters launch out. As the fighters hunt their eggs, Lanier does well, but it becomes apparent that Findel is not engaged in the exercise as he cuts off comms, and Lanier realises he's intending to suicide by impacting one of the asteroids to try and avoid bringing shame to his family. Lanier tries to talk him down on a private channel, but Findel cuts that channel too. Left with no option, Lanier overrides the AI and fires on Findel's fighter, killing its engines before pulling alongside and nudging it away from the asteroid. He then pours all power to his own engines to avoid Findel's original fate as he surface dances over the large rock Findel was headed for, just managing to work clear. Lanier feeds Montoya a barely convincing lie to cover his actions and Findel's, and in so doing Montoya gives him a failing mark and Findel a neutral mark. Montoya does, however, have a perfect grasp on the situation and reassigns Findel to a recruiting station with instructions not to admit anyone to the Rangers who is there for the wrong reasons, stressing that this is an honourable role that will help all his fellow Anla Shock. Findel exchanges a glance with Lanier and leaves the bridge. Montoya then lets Lanier know that he knows, by noting that private channels are not as private as Lanier might think, and acknowledges his good work before ordering the jump to the next training area. Delenn, Franklin and Sheridan are being regaled by Zack's recounting of Veer's adventures with the Drazi. Zack notes that Londo was like a proud father watching him go, but Veer wasn't actually arrested as the Drazi didn't want a record of why Veer went for him. Sheridan ruefully wishes they could bug Londo's quarters, but Delenn thinks it would be fruitless anyway, maintaining that Londo probably doesn't know anything, which, as Franklin notes, means that this goes beyond even the role of the Prime Minister, if true. Sheridan figures they have a month before someone takes matters into their own hands and everything goes south as a result. Garibaldi was supposed to be joining them, but is once again drunk in his quarters. He calls up the Fresh Air restaurant, having managed to find his link, and orders up a suicide pizza after introducing himself in a way only a truly drunk person could. The music builds to a warning note as the episode closes out. I wanted to like this episode, I really did, and yet it felt a bit jumbled to me. There are rather unusually 3 main plot threads running, one of which, Jakar's and Franklin's, rather dead ends midway through, perhaps in part to explain that as hard as Jakar tries, his acolytes are likely to find their own truths from his work, and he can only do so much in trying to help them understand what he was getting at. One thing I do want to call out, though, is a possible and unusual continuity error, because I don't recall Garibaldi ever having access to the Book of Jakar to be able to get a coffee stain on it. The Book of Jaquan? Yes. Thoughts? Veer's promotion and the bugging plot is nicely enough done, and feels a little similar to Franklin's announcement that he would be moving on. Londo here is effectively telegraphing a changing of the guard on the station when he becomes Emperor, and Veer taking his place is indeed like a father handing the family business to a son. Whilst he has not always been the kindest mentor to Veer, he obviously feels he's done enough to prepare him for this role, even if he sometimes demonstrates some non-Centauri traits. At the end of the day, Veer killed Cartagia, and that conspiracy means that Londo is unlikely to throw Veer in front of a cargo vessel, if you get my meaning. Purple Files, after all. I can't immediately think of when else we've seen Veer this season at the time of writing. The telepath plot effectively eclipsed a lot of normal goings on, as did Londo and Jakar being on Centauri Prime without him. Hence the gag about McDonald's, McBari, with Veer being home alone and failing miserably to eat properly. Sounds vaguely familiar. So, Lennier is back again after the Day of the Dead with a new scar courtesy of a Drazi recruit who he underestimated. Evidence Delenn feels of him pushing his training too hard. Quite possibly so, but as he wryly notes, had he not been doing that, would she have called him up for this mission? Fair point. Like Veer, we haven't seen much of him to this point this season, and like Veer, he's standing on his own 2 feet more readily than has previously been the case. This is not the first time Delenn has had a clandestine ranger meeting in a bar on the station, of course, the quiet irony here being that the ranger is now Lennier, not Marcus. Ironic in the sense that Lennier keeps telling Findel to join the Rangers for the right reasons, while he himself is arguably there for the wrong reasons, amongst which may be a desire to fill Marcus's shoes. Delenn knows something's amiss, she's not an idiot, and Lennier is almost coming out and saying it. I do find it really interesting that she isn't bringing John in on this, because whose honour is she saving by lying to him about meeting Lennier? It definitely seems that there might be some twists to the honour rule on lying that we're not privy to. This theme is of course continued as Lennier and Findel's situations play out. Both are interesting from a technical nerd point of view for me, as I don't think we've seen the inside of a Minbari fighter before now, only a flyer, their version of a shuttle. They clearly incorporate their version of an Alexa for flight and combat controls, but can also be very manually driven too. Whilst we see 3 fighters in the Bay of the White Star initially, we then have 4 cadets launching out in the rather nice red glow from the Dwarf, suggesting possibly a maximum complement of 4 fighters. Scale is always difficult to judge in space, but a White Star must be quite large to hold that many ancillary craft, and possibly a shuttle as well. I'm sure there'll be a deck layout somewhere on the interwebs if you're interested. Now, let me just rewind to the reason Lennier is on board this White Star in the first place. Delenn seems to suggest that they have particular insight into the Centauri, by which he's presumably meaning their general exposure to them during their time on the station. Yet in terms of actual combat with them, well, even the Centauri aren't bold enough to challenge them in Bari, so I guess she's thinking more in terms of general racial psychology. It just seems a little bit of a stretch given what she's asking him to do in terms of being on a White Star. Yet I can see that his experience could be advantageous over a scenario where a fellow Minbari would have 0 experience. The Findel plotline is a little obvious, if only because Lanier is light years ahead of him in real experience. It's saying a lot about the confidence in White Star jump engine precision for them to come back to exactly the same spot they originally left without cutting anyone's fighter in half. Possibly the fighters have a beacon they can lock onto to assist with that. Interesting that the fighters have a relatively limited life support provision. Obviously theirs had been reduced on purpose, but that implies they're not self-sustaining. So a group of Minbari fighters cut off from a mothership could simply be neutralised by waiting them out. I'm sure the same would be true of a Star Fury over time as well, but it does go to show how role-specific the fighters are in universe. They do exactly what it says on the tin, no more. The last few minutes are a little curious too. It's like we're being brought up to speed on the story so far and getting another reminder of just how far Garibaldi is unravelling, something which is pretty obvious at this point. You just wonder whether this is a spot of padding. It's even giving Sheridan a clock of a month by which the situation needs to be resolved, which feels a little odd. So I don't know. I do like seeing the way the Ranger recruits are handled, and the use of different coloured sun was a nice touch. In other respects, it felt like it was looking ahead too much, or just didn't quite know where it was trying to land itself. Some elements felt like they were borrowed from other episodes, Len in a hood getting into trouble in particular, feeling rather cliched at this point. So yes, it's not a terrible episode, but I'm being reminded of why Season 5 is so divisive, because we see a lot of characters we're used to seeing in particular roles, in very different roles, and it's a little disconcerting. That's perhaps a very human reaction, but I think perhaps part of the problem is we're not always seeing these changes happen on the station, so it's almost like we get jump cuts of development. Hopefully with the resolution of the telepath thread that was quite dominating early on in this season, the ISA plot can now fill itself out a little more and return us to more familiar territory. We shall see. Whilst I think about it, have a listen to the Grey 17 podcast, which is quite early in its life at the time of speaking. It's an interesting mix of non-spoiler chat with newcomers to the show, followed by spoiler-laden chat with old hands afterwards. I operate a kind of doublethink in doing these afterwards, so I don't spoil you, but if you are an older hand, maybe you can play my video and mute me whilst listening to the podcast if you want to remind yourself of the visuals. They're quite long, so I recommend them for travelling and such like. Having come across Grey 17, I'm also now aware of others, so do have a look around if podcasts are your thing. Until next time.